for this session, we are delighted to be welcoming a range of speakers to offer their views on responding to violence. So without further ado, I'd like to turn to our first speaker, Dr. Molly Wallace from Portland University, on From Defectors, Formers, and Military Dissenters to Credible Messengers, the Role of Lived Experience in Anti-Violence, Anti-War Activism. Molly.
Thank you, Alex. Actually, I have a slightly revised title, but that gives me the chance to state it myself. So the new title is Credible Messengers, Formers, and Military Refusers, Former Fighters as Resources for Violence and War Prevention. And the term military refusers I'm borrowing from Naya Zayfus, a recent article of hers. So I'm delighted to be here and with all my colleagues here in the room. And just to let all of you know out in the audience and here, this is a paper in the very initial stages, so I welcome feedback. So my starting point for this research is the direct violence that continues to plague the globe on various scales. So from the streets and other public spaces in the city and country that I live in, United States, to the war zones in Ukraine and Yemen and Syria and so on. And to many, as Alex was just saying, the answer is to protect or defend ourselves from the opponent's violence seems to lie, even if regrettably, in militarized responses. But these usually recreate the conditions for which they are meant to be a response. So what I'm interested in looking at today is another set of responses to violence that holds real promise, but has not yet been given the serious attention or funding that would make it a full-throated, viable policy option. It's a set of responses that sees the individuals involved in violence, or in particular in the opponent's violence, not as a problem that needs to be eliminated through further violence, but as a resource for disabling and preventing that violence, and particularly through their ability to disengage, desert, defect, or otherwise refuse to carry out objectionable orders, and then also to take on new anti-violence and anti-war roles in their communities. So first of all, such an approach requires a reorientation in relation to these fighters. And I'm using the term fighters, and it's sort of the generic term I'm using to mean any individuals who participate in collective violence across a range of different contexts. So a reorientation in relation to these fighters, seeing them not as a monolithic, static, unthinking block, but rather as reflexive, gendered individuals who often have unmet human needs. It's a different way to sort of think about those fighters. So the research question I'm looking at today in this paper is, how can engaging with fighters and former fighters realize new forms of violence and war prevention across various contexts? And then what are the ethico-political barriers to and implications of these forms of engagement in these different contexts? So in this paper, I'll explore these violence and war prevention responses made possible by this sort of engagement with fighters and former fighters. And I do so sort of intentionally examining a seemingly incongruous range of violent contexts. So from street violence, sort of gang or clique related violence, often in an urban context, to extremist violence, to military violence. Because I think we gain something by engaging with these different forms of violence together to see how disengagement or desertion from these groups manifests perhaps similarly, perhaps differently among them. And also, I think it's fruitful to notice sort of how we respond on a sort of ethical level to these different forms of disengagement and desertion. So I argue that fighters' disengagement or desertion can be a source of violence and war prevention in two main ways. And the first is through directly diminishing the military or fighting capability of the armed groups for which they previously fought. And second, through a turn to proactive anti-violence, anti-war activism that leverages their lived experience and credibility as former fighters to influence other current fighters and the broader community or society that they live in. But critically, as this type of behavior, so desertion, disengagement, is encouraged in some contexts, but not in others, we will not be able to fully exploit the potential of this violence or war prevention strategy unless we're willing to more fundamentally interrogate state militarism and our own dependence on military and violent tools. So first, turning to these dual violence prevention functions of fighters disengaging. The first, which is their ability to directly diminish the fighting capability of the armed group for which they previously fought. I think it's useful to think in the first instance about how we typically tend to respond to collective violence sort of against our own group or community. And that typical response, right, is to mount an armed response to protect or defend our own group, community, or country, the assumption being that only violence can stop violence, and that it does this through destroying the capability of the opponent to carry out its attack or invasion. Much in the way, I mean, we tend to assume that violence on this collective level can operate sort of as decisively as it might operate on the interpersonal level, where the use of violence could, you know, directly disable an attacker, right, through injuring or killing that attacker. And we tend to think that it operates on that decisive way, same decisive way on the collective level. But in fact, as Dustin Ells Howes argues, violence is not reliable or decisive on this collective level because the ability of our violence to effectively end the opponent's violence in the case of war or other collective violence actually depends on the reaction of the rest of the opponent group, so those not killed, to our own use of violence and any destruction it may have wrought on their fighters or weaponry or other equipment or infrastructure. So whether it diminishes or reinforces their will to continue fighting, even with limited military capability. So in other words, our use of collective violence is not actually, its effects are not automatic. It does not automatically disable our opponent. It actually could have the opposite effect. So, you know, due to strong impulses towards defending one's reputation, not to mention one's masculine credentials, experiencing losses in fighters or physical infrastructure often has this opposite effect of the deterrent effect intended, causing the opponent to double down on its own military strategy to prove that the losses were worth it and that they will not back down or be pushed around, right? So we sort of know this on some level, yet we tend, whenever confronted with violence, we tend to just assume that our own violence is the most decisive way of stopping it or ending it, when in fact it can reinforce the opponent's violence. So given these weaknesses, or at the very least uncertainties of violence as a tool for protection in the face of violence on a collective scale like this, I think it's worth exploring more innovative approaches. And one such approach is to look inside the black box, you know, of the opponent's side and notice those who are fighting for it. So as Jackson and Dexter argue, the mobilization of collective violence depends not just on the material structure, structural conditions for violence, but also the existence of willing agents to carry out this violence, and on the discursive conditions that make this violence meaningful and possible for them. So the old Vietnam War era saying, suppose they gave a war and nobody came, right? It can come across as somewhat naive until you start to notice the policies that states have put in place to ensure that their soldiers do not desert or do not refuse military service, right? So for instance, up to 7 years or even 10 years imprisonment in the case of armed conflict in Russia. In the US, dishonorable discharge, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, reduction to the lowest enlisted grade, and confinement for 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, depending on the circumstances. During time of war, the US actually still has the death penalty on the books for desertion, though that actually hasn't been used since World War II. So obviously states see this as a threat, right? And they also strictly control sort of the definition and sort of implementation of, you know, what counts as conscientious objection too, right? Because if too many people claim conscientious objection status, that also would be a threat to military capability. So the obvious threat that fighters withdrawing from war poses for a military mission or military readiness more broadly demonstrates both the possible effectiveness of this move, but also obviously the real structural constraints or deterrents that are placed on soldiers who may consider deserting or defecting, such that even individuals who wish to desert or disengage from the military may feel unable to do so. So this entails not just things like prison time and loss of livelihood and benefits, but also broader structural and cultural pressures that might make them less likely to desert or defect, right? So expectations of masculinity, of not being seen as cowardly, a commitment to their fellow soldiers, not wanting to let them down, but also just sort of practical questions around coordinating with other fighters and not knowing if other fighters share a same desire to leave. So these are all barriers to desertion or defection. So the fact that even under such adverse conditions, fighters do still choose to desert or disengage, defect, or otherwise refuse to carry out orders or continue their participation in state militaries or other armed groups indicates the intensity with which some fighters feel the need to leave, and suggests that many more fighters may want but do not see a way out, which draws our attention to an opening for more emphasis on policy and activism that reaches out to these fighters, the ones that may want to leave but feel stuck, in order to make this into a really viable violence or war prevention strategy. So on the level of state policy, there's an opening here to really work to diminish some of these costs of deserting or disengaging. And the most obvious ways to do so would be to offer some sort of asylum or passports, to another country, some sort of stipend or livelihood to give deserters, defectors when they leave a military organization. So these various proposals have recently come out along these lines with regards to Russian soldiers defecting or deserting in Ukraine. And also in international refugee law, right, there's a requirement, right, that states should allow asylum status to soldiers who are refusing to fight in an aggressive war. So that's important to note as well. So, but despite this real potential here for states to sort of take a more proactive role in encouraging this sort of desertion or defection, we aren't really seeing this. And obviously Ukraine has instituted some of these policies, but beyond that, the US certainly hasn't taken any of these policy actions, and the EU to some extent, but it hasn't really been a full-throated sort of viable response. It hasn't been easy for soldiers to move to other countries and to take up citizenship or refugee status in other countries. So the question is, why, even if this could disrupt the violence of our opponents, right? And I would argue that one of the reasons, among many domestic reasons, at least in the US, is that it would set a precedent and open up space for others to underwrite similar moves against our militaries in the future, right? And so our own commitment to militarism, I see as a significant barrier to our ability to fully realize the potential of encouraging desertion and disengagement as a viable policy option. So in light of this substantial obstacle to realizing this approach to violence and war prevention, at the state level, state policy, the role of former fighters as activists takes on greater importance, I think, as they have this special ability to leverage their lived experience and credibility as former fighters to influence other current fighters and the broader community or society away from violence. So to better understand some of these, the capacity of former fighters to do this, I think it's useful to look at the cases of so-called credible messengers or formers in two contexts in particular. So that in public health, sort of human needs-based approaches to preventing street level urban violence, often related to gangs or cliques, and supporting disengagement from violent extremist groups, whether neo-Nazis or religious fundamentalists. So both of these approaches see participation in violence as emerging from the frustration of, or rather perverse fulfillment of basic human needs, especially for identity, recognition, belonging, and meaning, but also for livelihood. And from a broader normative context or ideological framework that legitimizes and reinforces violence, often through particular norms of masculinity, among others. So therefore, instead of using further force or violence against those involved in gang or clique violence or in extremist violence, as would be the case with traditional policing or military responses, these approaches endeavor to reach current fighters on a human level to move them away from participation in violence. So with both approaches, the main people reaching out are individuals who have themselves previously participated in similar violent groups, often within the same community, providing them with a certain measure of credibility and respect, but also access and trust that others would not have in reaching out to these same current fighters. So I'll briefly note a few key characteristics of each approach with reference to some prominent organizations working in these spaces. So Cure Violence is a really well-known group in the former, and then Life After Hate and Exit Deutschland are good examples of the latter. So to look at the first, in the context of street violence, the use of credible messengers, Cure Violence is a violence prevention interruption organization that sees violence as something that can be transmitted much like a disease, and therefore should be treated as a public health concern rather than as a moral failing. And the model really comes with three elements: direct intervention in an interruption of violence through the work of violence interrupters, who sort of keep tabs on conflicts that are going on the ground and work to sort of calm down those conflicts and move people away from using violence in response to them, de-escalating them. Second, support for high-risk individuals, so those at high risk for being perpetrators or victims of violence, through mentorship of outreach workers who build relationships with these mentees and meet with them regularly, coaching them and make positive choices and connecting them to resources like jobs and drug treatment programs and so on. And then third, there's broader normative change at the community level through post-violence marches, sign campaigns, and other activities that demonstrate community response against violence. So those hired as both violence interrupters and outreach workers generally bring lived experience to these roles as formerly engaged in street violence themselves and sometimes formerly incarcerated even. And in this way, they act as so-called credible messengers. That's the term used in this context. So while violence interrupters leverage this lived experience to directly intervene in and de-escalate conflict to prevent violence, the outreach workers are sort of what we're more interested in here today, because they leverage their lived experience to build these longer term relationships with high-risk clients with the goal of moving them away from participation in violent activities. And they do this by nurturing both their motivation and enhancing their capability to desert, so to speak. So I'm going to draw a bunch in this part of the paper here from the research of Cozy Gay on Cure Violence, who's done some really deep, good qualitative research on outreach workers and clients in these programs. And there are sort of three sort of ways that this motivation is nurtured, at least that I'll be talking about today. And one is simply through demonstrating that other realities are possible. So many high-risk individuals living in these communities where Cure Violence works report feeling stuck and express the sort of inevitability around their participation in these violent cliques or gangs. So simply by modeling, by these outreach workers modeling their own life trajectories and their own ability to move out of these violent contexts and do something more productive with their lives through their work with Cure Violence, right? Even that modeling is enough to be a source of motivation for some of these youth who are still involved in violence. And second, these mentors are often able to cultivate motivation by modeling alternative, attractive forms of agency and masculinity in their relationships. So they, due to their lived experience, these outreach workers are they're adept at drawing on and leveraging the credibility and respect associated with the dominant set of norms, that sort of values in that context, that values violence and sees it as something that gives you respect, et cetera. And then subverting these in the articulation of a new set of norms, particularly around a sort of nonviolent form of masculinity. So particularly using the respect current gang-related youth may have for the outreach workers who may have been really big and may have been sort of well known for their use of violence, sort of gets those currently involved youth to actually listen when these outreach workers speak and model other ways of being in these contexts. And then third, another prominent way to sort of cultivate this motivation in current fighters, as I'm calling them, is through their desire for recognition and their desire to build the trust of their mentors. So much of the research shows that some of these young people are motivated when outreach workers sort of recognize in them, say, leadership capabilities or other strengths that can be put to good use doing something else in their lives, right? There's some value that these people see in them that can be put to other purposes, and that's a strong motivation to leave. And also the mentorship relationship, the constant checking in, the outreach workers being a sounding board for these fighters, in their desire to sort of move in a new direction, provides a sort of mirror-like function for them in their desire to leave, and a sort of checking in and building of trust with the outreach workers. So these are all ways that motivation can be cultivated in terms of facilitating the actual capability of those currently involved to leave. Just briefly, outreach workers also address sort of human needs, sort of livelihood, human needs of current fighters by providing access to resources like employment, education, drug treatment, and other positive social activities too. So that's sort of enables them to move out of that life. And then moving on briefly to the context of extremist violence and the use of formers in that context. So organizations like Life After Hate in the US and Exit Deutschland in Germany support individuals involved in extremist groups and their families in the disengagement process. And both organizations help to link up formers, so former mostly right-wing extremists, to those currently involved. And the work of formers in this context very much echoes the dynamics noted earlier with credible messengers, especially in the way that formers can model what it looks like to leave a violent extremism organization and show that it's possible in the first place. So that's huge. But one of the main differences, of course, is that extremist groups, unlike typical street organizations, are driven by ideology that dictates rigid racial or religious us-them categories that sort of become, part of the motivation for this disengagement is for formers to sort of at least provide some exposure to counter narratives to these narratives that are told inside the extremist organizations, and to help with sort of bring people currently involved into contact with targeted outgroups to sort of break down some of those or challenge some of those stereotypes that animate violence. And this is actually in research, one of the most common sparks for people starting to rethink their participation in extremist organizations is actually just interactions with people from one of the groups that their extremist group sees as the enemy or as the out group, right? Because those interactions start breaking down the ideology they've been consuming. So the role of formers here is really to be sort of a sounding board in this process and someone to check into as these questions start emerging. And then second, just in facilitating the capability of these people currently involved in violent extremism, one of the real barriers to disengagement in this context in particular has to do with the psychological and social barriers to leaving such a group. A lot of the research on violent extremism shows that the initial impulse to join a group like this is not so much the ideological piece, but rather the search for identity and group belonging and meaning, and these social ties that sort of bring people into the organization, and then they get sort of caught up with the ideology. And so it sort of follows that because the bonds that they've formed with these violent extremist groups fulfills some of these human needs for identity and meaning and belonging, the process of leaving is extremely difficult because these needs are no longer being met. So one way that formers help facilitate the capability to leave in this particular way is that they are sort of welcoming those considering exiting into this new community of former violent extremists, right? That gives new meaning now to their lives because one of the purposes now is to help other current violent extremists leave. So there's this sort of virtuous cycle of engagement in this process of helping others leave that can help to sort of fill those human needs again for identity and belonging and meaning. So in summary, both these approaches support the motivation and capability of individuals to leave these violent organizations and present powerful alternatives to more militarized approaches to violence prevention and security. And also both forms of violence prevention I've just mentioned, while running counter to more mainstream militarized responses to street violence and violent extremism, have actually gained some widespread acceptance and support in the broader public, especially in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matters protests in 2020, but also Charlottesville and other, violent acts of shootings throughout the United States that have been motivated by white supremacism, right? There's been a sort of impulse to find other ways to deal with this. So they've actually gained widespread acceptance, but at the same time, military desertion is still largely denigrated in the US and other countries. It's widely viewed as self-serving cowardice, abandoning one's comrades, abrogating one's duty to one's country. So the same pull of one's conscience that's celebrated in the case of withdrawing from street violence or violent extremism. So the realization there that what one is doing does not align with one's best self or one's ideals, that's not fully recognized in the case of desertion, despite the many similarities of the situations in which these fighters find themselves. So they're expected to kill enemy fighters who otherwise are very similar to themselves in age or who are up against the same constraints, right? Or even worse, to kill unsuspecting civilians who may have been framed in the group's discourse as legitimate targets for some reason or another, or who may simply be understood as regrettable collateral damage. So these are similarities in the experiences of these fighters, but we look very differently on their decisions to leave or refuse to carry out orders. But yet again, though we may look down on desertion in our own militaries, we also often celebrate it among the ranks of our adversaries, of course. But as I noted earlier, we aren't actually able to even fully act to support these forms of desertion in those cases because we're too worried about it coming back to haunt us with our own militaries. So in conclusion, I think if we wish to have this tool at our disposal to prevent or disable violence, even of our opponents, then we really need to be ready to question more deeply our own attachment to militarism. And to do this, we sort of as civil society, members of civil society, I think need to more vigorously explore, support, enable the activism of military refusers, just as we might the activism of credible messengers or formers, as they are particularly well suited to challenging militarism due to their embodiment through their own military service of mainstream militarist honor and values, which gives them to some measure a platform and sort of authority that others don't have in reaching audiences that may not be reached by other anti-war activists. And this is complicated. We've had some conversations about this before, and I'm sure other questions will come up. It's not maybe as easy as that, but I'll sort of end there. That just as with street violence and extremist violence, former soldiers and fighters are perhaps one of our best resources for dismantling militarism and preventing or disabling war. Thank you.